Associate Director of Asia Society's Center on U.S. China Relations. And we're here today to launch a new report by the Asia Society Policy Institute called Stacking the Deck, China's Influence in Technology Standard Setting. And I can say, as a former China correspondent who did my share of stories on China's tech sector and its quest to become a leading global power in innovation, that standard setting in technology is a particularly important subject that gets too little attention. Because embedded in technological standards are a society's values. Should the internet be free and open, or should cyber sovereignty reign, stopping information at the border that leaders may not like, while allowing those leaders to do ever more ubiquitous surveillance on their own citizens? Should privacy be respected, or is a person's data up for grabs, whether by profit-seeking tech companies or by authoritarian governments? And what about the world of 5G, 6G, and beyond, the Internet of Things world that includes everything from smart thermostats to smart cities? Will all that lead to better lives for most people, or to more control for those in power and perhaps more repression of everyone else? The answers to all these questions will be decided in part by the technology standards we set and by the rules we agree to abide by in our own countries and internationally. So when China takes an interest, as it has, in being much more active in setting those standards, we should pay attention. Even more so, given that China is rolling out its digital Silk Road around the world, building 5G telecommunications systems, smart cities, smart ports, and more. So, here to help us better understand what we should be paying attention to and why it matters are this new report's two authors. Danny Russel is Vice President for International Security and Diplomacy at the Asia Society Policy Institute, or ASPI for short. He's a former Assistant Secretary of State for East Asian and Pacific Affairs, and he was a career senior Foreign Service member at the State Department. He has also served under President Obama as Special Assistant to the President and National Security Council Senior Director for Asian Affairs, where he helped formulate President Obama's strategic rebalance to the Asia-Pacific region. The report's other co-author, Blake Berger, is ASPI's assistant director. He came to ASPI from the National University of Singapore's Center on Asia and Globalization at the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy, where he was a research associate. His research has focused on the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, or ASEAN, on US-ASEAN policy, and on China's Belt and Road Initiative, the most sweeping and ambitious global infrastructure initiative ever, with some 140 countries having signed on in some way, including many to the digital Silk Road. Blake and Danny have also written other reports on the Belt and Road, including Navigating the Belt and Road Initiative, what the BRI is and why it matters, and Weaponizing the Belt and Road Initiative, about the potential dual-use nature of some of the ports and other infrastructure that China is building around the world, including technological infrastructure, and how it could be used for military as well as civilian purposes. That includes smart ports and smart cities. So I have a few questions for Danny and Blake, but before I get to them, let me encourage you to submit your own written questions anytime during this conversation, and we'll get to them later in the hour. So first, Danny, why is it important to understand how and why China is increasingly interested in setting these standards?
Well, first of all, Mary Kay, thank you. And you gave a brilliant introduction to the report. Next time we publish a report, I'm coming to you first to write the preface, because you're very, very succinct and very clear. Look, I mean, it's not lost on the Chinese, and it hasn't been really since, certainly since Xi Jinping came to power, that as the world becomes more digitally connected, more digital reliant, that whoever is going to set the standards is going to have an outsized influence in shaping next generation technology. Many people watching, I'm sure, don't remember the beta VHS skirmish of my youth, but you know, just think of your iPhone's, you know, USB-C cable versus the old Lightning connector, and multiply that by like 1 billion. The point is that I think there's a world of advantages from being globally interoperable. It means you can sell your products overseas. It means on top of that, you can, you know, if you can get everybody to use your standards, you can collect royalties instead of paying them. Gives you a structural head start. So it certainly matters for the actors, for the countries and industries that are trying to take the lead. It also matters hugely, as you referred to, in terms of the value system that underpins them. And so on that basis, we looked hard at the tactics and techniques that the Chinese are using to advance their interest in standard setting. And in essence, what we found was that they were pursuing a kind of dual track program. Some of what they're doing very dramatically is through the international organizations responsible for setting standards. A lot of what they're doing is creating sort of facts on the ground through Belt and Road, and particularly the subset of Belt and Road you alluded to, the digital Silk Road. There's another one, the Space Information Corridor. These are packages of various technology. Many people are familiar with facial recognition driven by AI and so on, but there's a lot more, and we can delve into those specifics as well as the strategy in the report.
So Blake, when did China's leaders and the tech industry, much of it connected to the Chinese government in one way or another, when did they start showing a real interest in technology standard setting, and what were the first steps toward where we are now?
Thank you, Mary Kay. I would say that technology has always been of critical importance to the Chinese Communist Party, but we really saw an uptick following Xi's assumption of power in 2013, 2012, that international standards in placing Chinese nationals into leadership positions and increasing participation within these bodies really began to be incorporated into government documents around that time. And since then, it's only really ramped up, and there's been a slew of Belt and Road policies and digital Silk Road policies that have really advocated for Chinese nationals, for increased Chinese representation in these bodies. And so really over the past 10 years or so that we've seen a real uptick in this focus to really promote Chinese standards in these bodies.
And you quoted in your report, the two of you, that there are internal documents and speeches within China that suggest that the government's increased interest in standard setting is part of a considered strategy. Could you describe what that strategy is? Who wants to take that?
Well, let me start and then turn it over to Blake, because it's very much a considered and deliberate strategy. So I'd make 2 points. First is that you get a very different sense of what the PRC's strategy and intentions are, depending on whether you're listening to their inside voice or their outside voice, so to speak. Because Beijing's messaging for international consumption is very, mutually beneficial, win-win kind of rhetoric. But the Chinese Communist Party's messaging to the domestic audience, to the state council, to the agencies, to the industry, tells a very different story. That is framed as a zero-sum contest. That frames technology and standard setting explicitly as an instrument of national power that can be used to dominate future technology. The second point I'd make before turning to Blake is just that I see a connection to Xi Jinping's dual circulation policy, which I sort of loosely translate as, let's make China less dependent on the world, let's make the world more dependent on China. And I think that we are seeing this in both the two-track strategy that Blake can talk more about, but also in the effort to really exert a tremendous degree of control over data and the movement of data.
So there's sorry, go ahead. There was one quick follow-up. I mean, there's also political leverage that's built in to some degree, isn't there? If you control the 5G network, or you control something that is going to have a significant impact on how life is lived in a particular place, you've built it out. You can get some of what you want politically or geopolitically by having those relationships, by having installed that technology and having the recipient be dependent on you.
Well, absolutely. And that goes to the bigger Belt and Road and frankly, the Chinese overall engagement, part of which is very focused on what we would call elite co-option and creating dependencies. And look, digital dependency on China is in fact a real lever. May not be obvious to the purchasers from the outset, although more and more consciousness raising is taking place. But it may also seem like a reasonable price to pay for countries that are trying to catapult themselves into the digital era. So one of the things we found is what's called path dependency. In other words, the lock-in effect. It's not just locking countries into the technology of a handset or even of facial recognition surveillance equipment, but for things like competing GPS systems and for data management and emergency services. And I'd add that from the Chinese perspective, it also allows access to immense quantities of big data. And although China has a lot of domestic data, getting non-Chinese data is very important for Chinese companies to design products for global export. And collecting big data around the world has very direct military and intelligence benefits to the PRC itself, especially if they're building in back doors the way that they did to the African Union headquarters or data centers that we've seen them build in other parts of the world.
And even without the back doors, there was a new law passed in 2017, I believe, that said that technology companies and other companies in China need to cooperate with Chinese intelligence services if they're asked. Yeah. So Blake, part of the Chinese government's strategy aimed at becoming a global leader in leading technologies is to sell and often manage these technologies on the digital Silk Road, ideally with Chinese preferred standards embedded in them. How would you say that greater strategy is going at the moment? Danny referred to the fact that, some countries are reconsidering whether they want to take Chinese 5G or technology bundles for smart cities or smart ports or whatever. I mean, what has the experience been like along the digital Silk Road, along the Belt and Road Initiative, and where have there been bumps in the road?
Sure. I mean, I would even start before that by saying really, as Danny alluded to earlier, this dual track strategy is really taking place not only through the digital Silk Road, but also via China's increasing involvement and increasing advocacy within standards development bodies. So really this two-track approach is first setting de jure or formal standards through these international development bodies, by placing Chinese nationals in senior leadership positions or dramatically, increasing the representation in secretariats and technical committees, and also by, flooding the zone, quote unquote, by having, Chinese companies flood these processes with proposals and contributions, and then also by having Chinese companies then vote together as a bloc to support Chinese proposals. And so that's taking place within international standards development bodies. This is where the digital Silk Road comes in. And that's where China is, through the exportation of smart city systems or smart ports, or really you name it, China's establishing facts on the ground through market share. And so by increasing their market share and by dominating these markets, they're able to have widespread adoption of these technologies that really create future advantages for the Chinese companies. And as Danny mentioned earlier, potentially lock these countries into using that technology for the long term. Now, how is it going? I think, that's being played out, and we're seeing that China's being actually very successful. I mean, it's hard to argue that China has not established itself as a technological leader. And over the last 2 years, really, we've seen China pivot away from these big ticket, labor intensive, physical infrastructure projects towards more of a focus on the digital and technology infrastructure. And so while it's easy to present this as a top-down orchestrated plan, there's a lot more nuance to there. And, unfortunately, because of the vagaries of Chinese policies, it's actually a little hard to actually nail down what a DSR, what a digital Silk Road project is. But it'd be hard to argue that they're not being successful in doing so. In terms of the benefit, I mean, just look at recently in terms of Alibaba's announcement that they're setting up a data center in Thailand, or that they recently launched a data center in Indonesia. I mean, look at the continent of Africa. I mean, Huawei and ZTE are leading developers of smart cities and 5G networks, ICT networks. And so, you know, you're really seeing Chinese companies really be the leaders in these emerging markets in terms of really supplying these countries with digital technologies that they really need. That being said, it's not that this has been a, you know, easy ride, so to speak, and there have been speed bumps. Just look at the growing international concerns over the security vulnerabilities surrounding Chinese ICT technologies, and Huawei being chiefly one of those concerns. And as Danny mentioned earlier, you know, after the hacking of the African Union and the transfer of its data to China, you know, the African Union bought its own services and declined China's, you know, offer to configure them. You know, we've seen Canada, Italy recently announced that they would ban Chinese technology from its 5G networks. And so while, you know, there certainly are successes and there is progress, it's not been without its issues and roadblocks.
So it sounds like you're saying it hasn't been without its issues, but overall it's been quite successful. Or do you feel like that's true and it's sort of at an inflection point where a growing number of countries are sort of reconsidering how much they should tie their technological future to China?
It's hard to quantify or to use data to give a scientific answer to that. One of the things implicit in what Blake was describing that we've seen is there's a real divide between the wealthier industrialized countries and democracies and the less developed poorer nations. I mean, for one thing, the industrialized countries have more options and have the technical capacity to pick, choose, find alternatives, and also to de-risk Huawei products or other Chinese products so that they can be used, you know, safely. But for much of the world, the developing world, which doesn't have the luxury of those capabilities, you know, Huawei and Chinese vendors are often simply the only game in town. China's a huge exporter of communications technology. It's competitive in a lot of areas that just a few years ago, only the United States and a handful of Western countries could play in. And look, digital infrastructure today, it's not just that the Chinese companies find more profit with less risk in the digital space, although they do, compared to, you know, building a big concrete coal-fired plant or a highway. But it's also that the demand is skyrocketing. Demand for bandwidth, demand for sensors, demand for connected devices, and that's accelerated by the pandemic, and I don't think it's going to go away. So if Chinese technology is what's within reach, sure, there are downsides, and sure there's some skepticism, but there may not be a lot of alternatives.
So that, of course, begs this question about why there aren't more players in the game. If China's the only game in town, I mean, why aren't we in the game? I mean, you, Danny, you're a career diplomat, at least you were. How does that affect U.S. interests that we're not more actively involved in offering an alternative?
Well, I think the impact on U.S. interests is really a profound one. Not only because setting the parameters and the rules, shaping the standards for technology conveys immense influence and frankly power as well as financial benefits, but also because the Chinese are also exporting a paradigm of cyber sovereignty. And this is really the principle that the state should decide. The state gets to determine what data can flow where. And particularly, I think it is critical component of what Tony Blinken and others talk about as authoritarian tech or tech authoritarianism. And unfortunately, it is a marketable product. There is unfortunately no shortage of would-be authoritarian states that not only embrace the principle of cyber sovereignty, which is antithetical to a free and open flow of information and ideas and so on, but also points to a kind of balkanized internet with lots of national divisions and riddled with incompatible systems and no-go walls and barriers and so on. And those are obstacles to international commerce. They slow down technological innovation and so on. Secondly, the fact of the matter is that democratic governance doesn't lend itself to state direction of private industry. And the United States championed the internet, the sort of globalized information communications technology universe, which was driven by private industry. And something that we explained in the report and Blake alluded to is the fact that actual standard setting takes place in two distinct fora or tracks. Some are government to government, multilateral institutions, but many of them are what we call multi-stakeholder bodies, where experts and industry really take the lead. So we're looking at a clash between two very different approaches. We've seen the same thing with industrial policies, for example, where China is in a position to corral and direct all of the elements of national power, including the private sector as an extension of the party and the party state, and rally them behind an initiative. There are some very, very clear guidelines. In fact, you alluded to the 2017 law requiring private companies to support and cooperate with various Chinese agencies when it comes to information sharing and so on. But there have been a lot of new regulations and laws and directives, many of which are documented in the report, that reflect the kind of, what in other contexts we call civil-military fusion, a fusion between the state and now the private sector. And it poses in this realm, as it does in many others, a host of challenges for open societies. Now, our report concludes with some very concrete, very practical policy options and recommendations, not just for the United States, but for Western nations, democracies that want to act to help preserve choices, options, and on a more open internet system, particularly given that this sort of authoritarian tech connects to a Chinese effort to redefine democracy, to redefine human rights as something that the state gets to determine, because the real human rights are the collective human rights of the entire society and not the rights of any individual. So there's a lot going on here.
Yeah.
And we came away from our research and wrote this paper, seized with a sense of urgency.
So, Blake, you were talking about how you both were talking about here and in your report about how increasingly there are Chinese officials, tech companies, experts sitting in on these standards setting bodies. What are you already seeing from Chinese influence in setting standards? And have any of the changes that have happened to be fair, to to consider all possibilities. Have any, on balance, been positive for non-Chinese tech users?
Sure. I mean, certainly hard not to see that China and Chinese companies aren't already having an impact in influencing standard setting. I mean, just look at 5G standards. I mean, Huawei and ZTE are undeniably two of the leaders in this space, and other Chinese companies are playing a larger role in advocating for their standards in products and systems, including smart cities, facial recognition technology, and even the internet. That being said, China isn't the boogeyman, and not everything that Chinese companies do is nefarious. Chinese companies, like their American or European or Japanese counterparts, want their standards to be adopted. I mean, in order to collect royalties, to reach more consumers, more markets, and become more competitive. But what really is concerning are two real aspects. One is the role of the Chinese state in standardization, and the other is the normative values, as you mentioned, that are incorporated and imbued within these technologies. I mean, a great illustrative example of this concern playing out is over Huawei's new internet protocol, new IP, or as it's been rebranded, the Future Vertical Communications Network Initiative. That's currently being pushed through in the UN's ITU, the UN's ITU. So, if this is adopted at the ITU's meeting next spring, it could really drastically change the structure of the internet. Replacing the bottom-up private sector-led internet model with a far more top-down design that really centralizes control over the networks with the state. And really provides governments with vastly greater control over the internet and over public access to information. And so obviously this is extremely concerning and goes against the notion of a free and open internet and the freedom and the free flow of information and data. And so there are real concerns regarding Chinese standards.
So those are the concerns. Is there anything positive that's come out of the fact that China's more involved in standard setting?
I mean, absolutely. No, sorry, Danny, please.
Well, I was going to interject to add that, number one, clearly from the customer's point of view, the Chinese are offering something that they want, and something that they can't necessarily get anywhere. And while Washington and other Western capitals may have trepidation about what the implications are, the fact of the matter is, not merely in standard setting, it's a little harder, but in the provision of technology, China's making banking possible for millions, tens of millions of unbanked rural people throughout the world. China is providing access to smartphones that are used for basic education, for disaster response, for public health, and other purposes. So, there undoubtedly is a lot of good coming out of the very formidable presence of Chinese technology and tech products in the world on the markets. In terms of the upsides of standards per se, it's a good question. I'm not sure I know the answer, although I did notice that the Chinese in the standards context have pushed for lowering the prices of licensing intellectual property that's embedded in standards. And that's, for its own reasons, namely that Chinese firms are focused on market share and increasing the sales overall. They're not focused on monetization of intellectual property because they don't have quite the same history of developing intellectual property yet that Western companies do. So I'm sure that from the point of view of developing countries, not only is there an appeal to low-cost Chinese telecom hardware, but there's also an appeal to the idea that the West should make their intellectual property available, if not for free, at an affordable cost, rather than some of the expensive licensing that underpin patented technologies heretofore.
Danny, let me stick with you for a moment. So, in the report, the two of you frame China's export of its own technologies and technological standards as something that appeals in particular to not just to people looking for, a lower priced, technological system, but also to authoritarian governments. But there are also democratic leaning developing countries, to the point about price, who choose Chinese 5G and smart city, smart port technology because it's cheaper. And some actually I've actually heard when I was doing my own Belt and Road podcast, I heard more than once people say, well, if we're, the US spies through its technology too, so why pay more for it? So given what you found in your research, how would you answer that?
Well, I've heard the same thing, Mary Kay. And look, the world isn't going to unsee what it saw with the Snowden revelations. And there's some sordid history there. And look, there's no shortage of suspicion towards these huge US tech firms, internationally, or for that matter, in the United States. Maybe there's more suspicion in the United States. But when you look at the polling done in various parts of the world, if you look at the behavior of consumers and of governments, frankly, when they have a choice, I think that there is a tremendous amount of trust in the United States, a certain amount of skepticism about Chinese products, and something of a predisposition in favor of American and Western technology when there really is a choice. But in many, many circumstances in much of the world, there is no readily available alternative to what the Chinese have to offer. And that makes the issue of choosing a moot point. So notwithstanding revelations about Chinese hacking or data mining or network infiltration and so on, I think that for, the governments in the developing world are not doing comparison shopping. They're contending with the question of whether or not they can get a digital system. So, as I say again and again, you can't beat something with nothing. So we've got things like the Build Back Better World initiative. We've got the Quad infrastructure partnership and so on. These are great. These sound great. These will be great. But they're not options on the menu right now. So there's a long way to go before these programs can provide emerging economies with offers that are comparable to what the Chinese are selling. And certainly for authoritarian states, the types of surveillance or censorship systems that the Chinese are offering are never going to be provided by the West. So I don't think the problem is that the customers see, well, US and Chinese tech products, it's sort of 6 of one, half dozen of the other when it comes to security. It's that they're not seeing access to the kind of US tech products that they need, at least to the extent that they need.
Yeah. So in the report, and to some extent this conversation as well, you focused on the fact that, Western countries and free market democracies in general, in Western countries, it tends to be industries that set standards, not governments. Whereas in China, it's the state guiding, quote unquote, both state-owned enterprises and private industries, and getting everyone to vote as one in international standard-setting bodies. To what extent do you think the United States and its allies and like-minded countries, like-minded governments, could be more effective in countering that unified Chinese approach and advocating for standards that support a more open internet that respects what the UN recognizes as universal political and civil rights? Who wants to take that?
I'll take a stab at that.
Okay.
While China may be one of the leading proponents of cyber sovereignty, they're certainly not alone in pushing back against the free and open internet. Even prominent democracies in recent years have taken steps to limit the access to and the spread of information. Look no further than Germany and India to see how democratic states have really crafted policies to control online information. But despite those differences, there are real opportunities for the US and its allies and other like-minded partners to cooperate with one another in addressing the issues surrounding China's push and other authoritarian nations' push for cyber sovereignty and internet governance. The US should not walk alone in this. Collaboration is vital to ensuring that standard setting and cyber governance are transparent and inclusive processes. As the Quad grouping continues to take shape, there have been real positive steps within this framework to promote this kind of action. What is important to note is that any kind of initiative should be inclusive and should encourage other partners, such as South Korea, New Zealand, Taiwan, and other G7 countries to participate. So, by kind of having this collaborative framework, they can really develop joint positions and advocate for their positions and policies in other bodies and forums such as APEC, the World Internet Conference, and industry events to really make sure that these processes do remain open and transparent. And so there is real opportunity for collaboration among democracies and like-minded states to push back against this motion.
Yeah.
Mary Kay, and if I could jump in on that.
Please.
There are two other relevant recommendations in our report, apropos of your question about what should the U.S. and others be doing? I think, and this is prejudice from my experience in government, step number one is to figure out what is really important and to separate the important from the noisy and the urgent. So I think that for the U.S. And for other democratic governments, developing a coherent national strategy on priorities in global governance, priorities that reflect national security interests and competitiveness interests, is going to help shape priorities for standardization. So, before you leap into action, you really need to figure out what it is that you're trying to do and how. So it's not good enough merely to complain about what the other guy is doing. And I think as a practical matter, it might make a lot of sense in the case of the United States government to designate a single coordinator who's responsible for, in the first instance, coordinating with industry and with civil society and with the scientific community, with technical experts, because as I alluded to and you pointed out very articulately, the Chinese state is good at controlling, marshaling, all of the resources of the society, and democratic systems are not. So I think at a minimum, having a point of entry of responsibility for coordination with these other stakeholders is important. Second thing I think that's important is simply putting some money behind standardization. So there are a number of government agencies that have standard setting responsibilities. There are a number of private sector would-be participants in the standard development organizations who would behave differently if there were more incentives to go to participate. And so it's not only the big tech firms or the big ITC companies, but a lot of small and medium-sized businesses, a lot of groups, both industry groups and community groups. Their participation in standard setting organizations and discussions, I think, matters, as would U.S. government funded programs to incentivize the next generation of technology standards professionals. I mean, this is a real discipline, and it's not just coding. It's not just being an engineer. The arcane world of standard setting, which Blake and I, have amateurs, have only just sort of peered at through the keyhole, is tremendously important. And so as in many things, building our human capacity should be a focus of a deliberate U.S. government strategy.
So that needs to be balanced, I guess, against a widespread reluctance, perhaps even an allergy in the U.S. private sector toward anything that could be considered industrial policy. So, I mean, you can certainly make a strong argument that government-funded research through DARPA and elsewhere has led to the development of radar, the internet, GPS, and the government tax incentives and subsidies, could encourage the private sector to focus on areas where breakthroughs in technologies are needed, to come together to work on standards. But like, how do you get through that reluctance? How do you persuade the private sector in the US that the government can help?
I've never encountered anybody in the private sector that was reluctant to have an infusion of financial support from the U.S. government. I think that in terms of industrial policy, there's a universe of difference between government coordination and support for private industry, for other stakeholders and actors, and decisions about where companies will make their investments, and government intrusion in a way that has trade distorting effects. That's the problematic kind of industrial policy that I think would face a lot of resistance. But we saw in the COVID-19 pandemic the tremendous effects of agile government investment in medical technologies and in the production of urgently needed vaccines and help in distribution of the vaccines and so on. I think that in a similar vein, that there would not be resistance to governmental support and government as a convener, as long as they weren't presuming to boss around the scientists, the engineers, the specialists, the companies that are actually creating the technology and conducting the science.
So I want to get to your questions, those of you listening in a moment, but I just want to say I appreciate your optimism at the end of this report that diplomacy and incentives could lead China to come closer to accepting international standards. The journalist in me has to play devil's advocate and ask, how realistic do you think that prospect is, given that Xi Jinping appears to see this era in U.S. China relations as being more or less a zero-sum competition, and that if China pulls enough other countries into its orbit through standard setting, economic and trade ties, and accompanying political and perhaps military coercion, it will have accumulated the power that allows it to ignore U.S. diplomacy. So, we've got, part of the answer to this is, from the U.S. side might be, we need to work more effectively. It certainly is. We need to work more effectively with our like-minded friends, allies, and partners, but we've got a mixed record on that front, which the Biden administration is now trying to improve. Meanwhile, the Xi administration has its own goals, and finding middle ground with the United States isn't necessarily one of them, unless it gets China something it wants in the long term. So that's a long question, but what would that something be that China doesn't already have?
Well, look, I would frame the question a little bit differently. And let me start by saying I have a 33-year career as a U.S. diplomat, a lot of which was dealing with and butting heads with Chinese counterparts and so on. So I definitely am not naive about dealing with China. What I would say is that we are engaged in what I like to call casino gambling. In other words, we have to play the odds. And this is a formidable challenge that we face across a variety of domains, but in particular in the technology domain, with the acceleration of Chinese capabilities, its assertiveness, its overall rise. And so we can't miss a trick. One of the tricks is actually talking to the other guy. It's not penicillin. It's not, Moderna vaccine. It's not a cure-all, but it's one of the tools available to us, and we need to use all the tools we've got. So I don't think that the Chinese are disposed to cooperate with us for the sake of cooperation, notwithstanding, nice-sounding Chinese win-win rhetoric and so on. And I don't think that we can trade something that the Chinese want in commercial terms, with geopolitical terms, with defense terms, in that kind of cold-blooded barter. I know the Chinese have a reputation for being very transactional, but I am increasingly of the mind to think that Xi Jinping is reasonably confident that he can get the things that he wants in the long term without giving anything away. And there are all kinds of other problems in that kind of drug deal trade. But think about the areas of overlapping interests. I mean, it's almost cliche to say that the U.S. and China each face a host of global problems that neither one can solve on its own. And the discussion of technical standards can be oversimplified as nothing more than a great power competition for international influence. But there are practical applications here that are quite consequential for both governments and for both decision makers. Like, for example, artificial intelligence is destined to suffuse so many aspects of our lives, and it's going to be used increasingly in industries that involve what we call safety critical applications, like nuclear power station. And think about Chernobyl, think about 3 Mile Island, think about Fukushima. Failures come with immense consequences. And so the day will come when Chinese government and the US government accept that they really need to figure out how to manage some of these new technology-driven challenges. It's not us versus them. It's getting ahead of it. And I think in a similar vein, on a more sort of positive, not just in the prevention mode, but in healthcare. The reciprocal data sharing, for example, can facilitate international research, can help coordinate responses to public health emergencies, can help cure cancer, right? And there is cancer in China, there's cancer in the US, there's cancer everywhere. So the inability to reconcile different data sets poses a life and death threat, frankly, to citizens of all of our countries. And so it's not Pollyanna. And I am not for a moment suggesting we're going to somehow talk Chinese leaders down off their strategy and get them to be more like us. We've certainly proven that strategy isn't going to work. But there are reasons to engage. There are, I think, imperatives that take us in that direction. And at a minimum, we can't afford not to try using all the tools at our disposal.
So, Blake, I'd love to hear your take on this, particularly given your focus over time on ASEAN, on the Southeast Asian countries, in terms of how they're viewing the role that China's playing in standard setting, and the fact that the Chinese government feels like, and we have a right to do this. We are the world's second largest economy. We are exporting our technology around the world. The US did this, Japan did some version of it. We're a huge power. Why is anybody getting in our way? Do Southeast Asians see that as, yes, absolutely? I mean, obviously Southeast Asia is a big place and many people have many different opinions, but what sorts of opinions are you hearing on that front?
I would say that, as we know from both of Southeast Asia, they want the best of both worlds. They want both American and Chinese participation and engagement in the region. Southeast Asia is also home to a tremendous amount of Chinese technology and digital Silk Road projects. I mean, look at Malaysia. There's an establishment of an e-commerce system. The digital yuan is being established there and being set up there. In Thailand, there's data centers. So while they may be concerned about the security implications and vulnerabilities of these systems, they're certainly not shying away from accepting them. So while they may try to impose certain measures or security measures in order to prevent the flow of data, they're still going to accept these systems. And so, as Danny mentioned earlier, without a credible alternative and an affordable alternative, where can they turn to? So, from what I've seen is that Southeast Asia is more than willing and more than wanting of these Chinese technologies, and they rightfully should be. These countries want to be digitally integrated into the global economy. So there should be no expectation that they shouldn't want to accept these technologies.
So that's one part of what is happening, but I'm also curious about what you've seen and heard about Xi Jinping and some other Chinese leaders before him have said this should be Asia for Asians. This should be Asian leadership in all things. Lee Kuan Yew had a version of that, the Asian values argument, that Asians have a way of looking at collective values and so forth. And I'm just wondering whether, when it comes to technology and technological standards, not can I afford it or not, but who should be setting the standards, whether there is even perhaps some pride that China, as a great power, is stepping forward to at least be part of setting standards, if not becoming a leader in it.
I mean, from China's perspective, it's, and we mentioned this significantly in the report, it's about discourse power, right? It's about controlling the agenda. It's about setting the agenda. It's about carving a path forward in order to promote Chinese interests. And so we shouldn't be shocked by that. That's what Chinese policies and that's what they've been advocating for years. And so none of that should come as a shock. I mean, on the Southeast Asian perspective, I mean, this, the Snowden revelation, I mean, Mahathir, when Prime Minister Mahathir from Malaysia, when accepting one of the large digital Silk Road projects, said the U.S. spies as well. So that both countries are involved in this, their vulnerabilities to accepting both kinds of technologies, but they simply just don't have a choice of where to turn to if China's the only one offering them these technologies at a price that they can afford.
Yeah.
Okay, I think that there is, in fact, a sense of admiration and maybe shared or reflected pride among many Asians at the extraordinary success that China has had on a number of fronts. And there is certainly a palpable desire to get in on the game and to be part of the growth of the economy and to have access to the technology and so on. But beyond that, I, at least in my diplomatic career and since my engagements with various variety of Southeast Asian counterparts, remain convinced that the Southeast Asian or the East Asian approach is not an either-or proposition, that they chronically want the best of both worlds, and in many cases, born of long experience, are absolute masters at arbitrage and at navigating sort of the balance so that they're not forced to make irrevocable choices or to align with one as a bloc. They clearly want the benefits that they can derive from China across a number of areas, including technology. And they also want the benefits they can derive from the active engagement of the United States, including in particularly in technology. So it's not news, but they want to have it both ways. And overall, they're pretty good at getting it.
So one of the places where China has been active in setting standards and being involved in rules-making bodies is at the United Nations. And I've noticed, I'm guessing you guys have as well, that in recent months, maybe the last couple of years, there's been an increasing focus in speeches and articles within China, leaders' speeches, focusing on the UN as the quote unquote only appropriate center of global governance. Now, this comes at a time when China is also talking about the Belt and Road Initiative forming a community of common destiny. I think back to the One World, One Dream motto of the Beijing Olympics back in 2008. What's going on here? Is this that the standard setting that China's doing is not necessarily just for, it's part of the strategy we talked about earlier. It's not just for being able to get products to market. It's the Chinese leadership and Xi Jinping in particular see this as a moment where China can potentially play a role in the world as, if not the predominant leader, then one to rival the United States. And just adding to that in terms of global governance, I mean, since there are so many Belt and Road partners who are themselves members at the UN, it suggests that there are votes there, that might go in China's direction if we were to increasingly rely on the UN for global governance, which, it's an open question whether that would ever happen, but go on.
Well, it's a great observation and a great question. Look, I think that the shift on the part of China in its approach to and its behavior in international organizations is really fascinating. And frankly, it's one that I personally witnessed. I served at the U.S. mission to the UN from 1989 to 1992. So during and after Tiananmen, during and after the collapse of the Soviet Union, during the presidency of George H.W. Bush, who himself had been not only the head of liaison office in Beijing, but more relevant, had been U.S. ambassador to the UN and was a deeply committed multilateralist, internationalist. And that was the very beginning of the creation of the Perm 5 and the Security Council. It's the very beginning of China's extremely reluctant and tentative steps to engage in multilateral diplomacy. I used to privately joke that the Chinese in the UN were like an inert landmass that would never make eye contact. They wanted to hold the seat, but they didn't want to take the microphone or the gavel. Wow, those days are gone. And, I think part of it, Mary Kay, comes from, the chapter in the Marxist-Leninist playbook that lays out, co-option, right? How you bend existing structures to serve your interest. And, I think it's not unrelated to the way that the Chinese Communist Party has begun appropriating the term democracy and redefining human rights, as I mentioned, as collective interests determined by the state that supersede individual rights, individual freedoms, and so on. So I think one attraction is that the UN Charter enshrines very clearly the principle of national sovereignty. And that fits well with the cyber sovereignty construct that the Chinese and frankly that the Russians are also pushing, right? If the world has national borders, then the cyber universe does too. And we get to decide what our citizens can read and hear and say. And we have absolute control over any data or information from within our systems, and we control this semi-permeable membrane. I think it's in part because of the fact that the Chinese can block action in the UN Security Council. That's not irrelevant. And as you alluded to, for sure, the fact that they have, won friends and influenced people, so to speak, through the leverage and the influence they've gained in the Belt and Road, which, as I've said, is far more than just a series of infrastructure projects. It's really a comprehensive strategy to create relationships of dependency, to bolster Chinese access and influence with power holders and so on. And look, I think maybe the critical point is the one that Blake made, which is that it's about discourse power. It's about the great strength of the argument, call it propaganda, that China is the real champion, defender of multilateralism. And the United States is the violator, is the lone wolf, is the one out there creating these Cold War type blocks and alliances. And, heaven knows this was an easy case for the Chinese to make during the 4 years of the Trump administration, and they're still at it.
Yeah. We are pretty much at the end of our time, but Blake, I want to give you a chance if you'd like to add anything to that, or if you have any other final thoughts that you can share in a minute or less.
Absolutely, and thank you. I would just add on to that, by really focusing, especially with cyberspace and internet governance, those processes have traditionally really been grounded in the multi-stakeholder model and in venues where the US has historically dominated. And so Beijing, by elevating the UN within this framework, is seeking to really undercut the status quo. And so with China's top-down, state-centric approach towards seeking control over the internet, it really should come as no shock that the UN and its intergovernmental model of internet governance really accords with Beijing and their point of view.
Berger, Danny, Russell, go ahead.
Sorry, I know we're running into double overtime here, and I'm sorry to elbow my way in to have the last word, but I do want to underscore that, we have documented in detail a whole range of problems derived from Chinese behavior in connection with the standard setting, both the de jure SDO type and the de facto Belt and Road and digital Silk Road type. But I want to underscore, it is entirely appropriate for China to play a role in shaping technology governance, in keeping with its growing status as a technology leader. And as China expands its influence, whether it's through SDOs or the digital Silk Road, its ability to shape global tech standards is going to go up, not down. But the issue is not what China is doing. The issue is what the United States and other like-minded societies, both governments and industry, are going to do. And, given the importance of these standards in terms of economic competitiveness, in terms of national security, and also in terms of the values, the freedoms rooted in an open internet, I hope this report is really a call to action for policymakers in the West to up their game.
And that report again is called Stacking the Deck, China's Influence in Technology Standard Setting, and you can find it at asiasociety.org. Danny, Russell, Blake, Berger, thank you for your insights. Thanks to all of you for listening. Have a good evening. Or